Hey everyone, this is Brown at IF Brown, and while I had a little bit of time on my lunch break, I wanted to do like I said I wanted to do yesterday, and that was to talk about some divisive horror movie sequels. And today I wanted to talk a little bit about Hellraiser Inferno. This isn't a full-on review, it's just me throwing out some thoughts on its divisive nature and how the fan base is very mixed as far as that particular movie goes within the Hellraiser series. But so in case anyone listening doesn't know, Hellraiser was a horror movie that came out in 1997, and it was written and directed by Clive Barker, who is also very well known as a novelist. He wrote the Books of Blood, The Damnation Game, Weave World, Imagica, and I mean, very good stuff. And also he wrote the stories that the movies Nightbreed and Candyman, as well as Midnight Meat Train, were based on. And Hellraiser was actually based on his own novella, The Hellbound Heart. And so he wrote and directed his own adaptation of his own work. And Hellraiser was a rather, unique entry in 80s horror, and it was also a successful entry as well. It was very groundbreaking, very original, atmospheric, and also very relatable because, I mean, while there's definitely some cutting-edge horror within that movie, there's also a lot of relatable family drama, as well as depictions of human nature within that movie. And so Hellraiser definitely stood out, but the main thing that people remembered from that movie visually was the Cenobites, or I should say were the Cenobites, and namely the lead Cenobite, as played by Doug Bradley, who would eventually become known as Pinhead, because he is a demon who has needles and like this gridded pattern all around his face and head. But anyway, though, the Cenobites were very memorable creations, and they definitely stayed with those who saw the movie, I mean, on a purely visual level. And so, they made a couple of sequels afterwards. The first sequel being Hellbound Hellraiser 2, which came out in 1988, directed by Tony Randall. And then there was Hellraiser 3, Hell on Earth, and Hellraiser 4, Bloodline, or just Hellraiser Bloodline. And so where Hellraiser Inferno falls is that not only is it the fifth entry in the series, but it's the first entry that was not only direct-to-video, but it's the first entry that had no involvement from Clive Barker. And so I remember when I first heard about the movie, I had only seen the first one. I think I might have. I soon after I saw the first one, I eventually saw a second one. But anyway, though, I hadn't seen the third and fourth one yet. But anyway, Inferno, though, was very divisive, I remember, because a lot of people were, pissed off that Pinhead wasn't in the movie that much. Because apparently in 3 and 4, I mean, he kind of, had the spotlight for most of the movie. And then also Clive Barker himself came out in condemnation of the movie, basically saying it was a lousy movie, don't go see it, and what have you. And so when the creator of a franchise goes out of their way to say don't go see this sequel that is a part of the franchise, that doesn't really bode well. But I remember, though, I also read a couple of reviews that were well thought out and well written, that were fairly positive of the movie. Now, granted, those at the time were few and far between, but at the same time, they kind of stood out simply because of how well worded they were and how well thought out they were. And so I remember I had there was a Blockbuster near where I lived at the time, because I was still living with my folks, and I remember it was like a week I had the house to myself, and so I was like, horror movies, here we come. So yeah, I remember I went to Blockbuster, rented a ton of horror movies, and I mean, that's how I first saw Hellraiser. But anyway, though, I also rented Inferno, And so I remember I watched it, and I remember thinking, I mean, yeah, it had some problems, but overall, though, it actually wasn't a bad movie. I mean, it was different from the stuff that had come before, or from what I'd seen and heard about before, but at the same time, I thought overall it was a fairly solid movie. And it wasn't until several years later that I actually saw 3 and 4 finally. And I have my own thoughts on those two. I think that there are some neat things about those two movies, about Hellraiser 3 and 4, but overall they just really weren't. I didn't like them that much. I mean, they were okay, but just not, I don't know, they just didn't really scream classic sequel or anything like that. And not to say Inferno's a classic sequel or anything, it's just I think that watching Inferno, then comparing it to Hellraiser 3 and 4, and I know it depends on a person's tastes and perspective, but I actually liked it more than 3 and 4. And I think that in some ways I would rank it up there with Hellbound Hellraiser 2, in the sense that it felt like, I mean, it felt more, I guess, original in some ways, and intriguing. And also, I liked how they were trying to do something different with it in some ways. Even though, I mean, one of the criticisms is that it feels like the movies Bad Lieutenant and Jacob's Ladder kind of mixed together, maybe with some Silent Hill thrown in. And that just happens to have Pinhead and a couple of Cenobites, what have you, or the Lament configuration thrown in as well. And that's a fair criticism. I can actually understand that. And I think in some ways, for me at least, that's kind of part of the charm, because I mean, those movies, Bad Lieutenant and Jacob's Ladder, as well as anything from Silent Hill, I mean, they're very influential, and there's a lot of relatable stuff when it comes to, say, human drama and horror that you can take from all that. And of course, going back to the first Hellraiser movie, I mean, there's a lot of human depravity sort of driving things as well. And so and the Cenobites, I mean, yes, they're involved, they're pulling the strings, but they're not the ones making the choices. It's the main character who's getting more and more drawn into hell. And so yeah, it was kind of a mixed blessing as far as that goes, because I mean, it's definitely derivative of those movies and series, but at the same time, I think in the way they handled it, it actually kind of helped too. But another thing I liked about this entry was that it felt like you were getting a glimpse outside of the established story that had been ongoing since the first movie, because in some way it had all been related to, say, the Cotton family, from the first one. And I mean, it sort of broke away from it in 3 and 4, but at the same time, it's like there are elements that wouldn't have come into place without the Cotton family's involvement, or without Kirsty's involvement, and what have you. And so here, though, it really felt like also, I should say that in the fourth one, in Hellraiser Bloodline, they did break away from the whole Cotton family storyline, but at the same time, even though there was a different focus on a different there was a different protagonist that was given the focus in that movie, because it was kind of an anthology line, but it was like one actor playing 3 different family members down the ages, for that movie. And so I thought that was actually a nice change of pace, but because of how brief each segment was, I really didn't think you got enough time to, say, appreciate the stuff that went into, say, the backstory. Like the backstory, the glimpses we got were very intriguing. It's just that they were very rushed. And so, in terms of character empathy or sympathy, we really didn't have much to work with, simply because of how quick everything was done, or how quickly everything was done. But whereas Hellraiser Inferno, we have the character of a Detective Thorne, as played by Craig Sheffer, who, he's given the spotlight in the movie, and he's a corrupt detective. And I do agree with a lot of the naysayers in the sense that they made him too unlikable as a protagonist. And the thing is, the fact that he's a corrupt detective, okay, him being unlikable as a person, it's going to be understandable. But at the same time, there were moments that I was like, I know I'm with this guy throughout the whole way because he's the protagonist of the movie, but I wish there was something that was there that I could connect with. And every once in a while, there'd be a little bit of something, such as, his horror at, maybe not being able to prevent, the death of a, loved one or something like that. Those moments were like, okay, that's very human, that's very relatable. And at the climax of the movie, when the truth is finally revealed, it's like, Craig Sheffer, really tapped into something to get this, intense emotional, burst of, inspiration. And it's like, in that moment, I actually felt for his character. I'm not saying that excused his behavior, throughout the whole thing, but at the same time, on a purely human level, that was a moment where we're like, oh my God, you poor bastard, that kind of thing. But at the same time, I really think it would have helped if, they'd done something here and there to make his character maybe just a little bit more likable. So that way, yes, we know he's corrupt, he's not a nice guy, but he's not, without some shred of, decency, that kind of thing. But I will say, though, that I appreciate the fact that they went with a wholly unconnected storyline that was separated from all the stuff that had come before. And so, and it also kind of reminded me of the Epic comic book series. There was an imprint from Marvel Comics that was literally called Epic that specialized in material for more adult readers, and Hellraiser was one of the books that came out of that line. And I remember there'd be a couple of bookstores here and there that would have trade paperbacks of that, and I never bought them, but I would take the time to look through them, and I read a couple of the stories, and like it was like an anthology series almost, and some of the stories were good, some of them not so much. But Hellraiser Inferno definitely made me think of something from the Epic comic book line that Marvel had put out, for Hellraiser. And so I liked that about the movie as well. And so I also liked the Cenobites and how they were depicted. Just basically how, they're not given a lot of focus, but at the same time, you have those moments where, you're reminded of how far above everything they are. And it's like, no matter what the main character does, he's not going to be able to stop them. He's not going to be able to beat them. It's just he's forced to go on this twisted trail that they're weaving for him. And also you have James Remar's supporting role as a therapist slash priest who works with the police department, but he has some knowledge about the Cenobites and the limit configuration. And there's this really nice scene where he's sitting down with the Detective Thorne and telling him what he knows about the Cenobites. And the way the scene is done, it's very, very calm, very subtle, nothing elaborate. It's just James Remar talking to Craig Sheffer. But the way the acting is done, it's very well done, and you get just how horrifying the situation is for someone who's being hunted by the Cenobites. And so I liked that about the movie, and like how it depicted the Cenobites, and how hell comes for whoever opens the box. And so but yeah, and I think that Scott Derrickson, this was actually his first real movie that he directed, but he's someone who's, hit or miss, in my opinion. Like, when he's good, such as, say, movies like Exorcism of Emily Rose, Sinister, or Doctor Strange. Like, that was actually an awesome movie, and in my opinion, one of the best Marvel movies put out. And Benedict Cumberbatch killed it as Doctor Strange. I never thought I'd see the day where, someone involved with the Hellraiser series was going to be directing a Marvel movie, let alone one that was so awesome. And so, so when Scott Derrickson's on, he's on. But unfortunately, he also, does some stuff that's less than stellar, such as, the ill-advised remake of The Day the Earth Stood Still. And, the one good thing about that movie was Keanu Reeves, and that should tell you something. I mean, nothing against Keanu Reeves. He's a cool dude, and he's definitely come a long way since then. I mean, he kicked ass as John Wick. But it's just at the time, strong acting was not his forte, but at the same time, he did a good enough job in that movie where he was literally the only good thing about the movie. And so it's like, the original Day the Earth Stood Still, it's a classic. I'm like, why are you remaking that? Anyway, though, but also you had, like the movie Deliver Us from Evil, which, could have been a good movie, but it was a disappointment. And so, so Scott Derrickson, his work tends to be hit or miss, but I think Hellraiser Inferno, for a first-time effort, was actually not a bad movie. I'm not going to say it's a full-on good movie, but at the same time, I think it stands with, say, Hellbound Hellraiser 2, in the sense that it's one of the few sequels within the Hellraiser series that's legitimately worthwhile in its own way. The first movie in the series is the best, but in terms of trying to do something different and unique, I would say, Hellbound Hellraiser 2 and Hellraiser Inferno are probably two of my favorite entries. There are moments of Hellraiser 3, Hell on Earth, that I liked, but I just didn't think it was a good movie overall. But in terms of, like, overall movies in general, Hellraiser 2 and Hellraiser Inferno were probably my favorite sequels in this series. Although I do still need to see the last two, Judgment and Revelations, I think it's what they were called. Or maybe it's Revelations and then Judgment. And then, of course, I need to see the remake that they did recently. I heard that one was actually, pretty good. But anyway, though, so Hellraiser Inferno, much like Halloween 3 Season of the Witch, it has its problems, but overall, I thought it was a solid movie. I'd easily give it 3 out of 5 stars. And also, another thing is that I have some fond memories of the movie. There was the aforementioned bit where, I had the house to myself, for a week, and, I binged out horror movies, and so that was one of the movies that was in that binge. But also, fast forward several years later, my friend Lauren and I, shout out to you, Lauren, stay safe out there. She and I had a Halloween double feature Fright Night, and so she came over to my apartment, and we hung out. We had something from some Tex-Mex place for dinner, and she brought The Ring, which I had not seen before, and I chose Hellraiser Inferno because she'd seen the first one, but she hadn't seen any of the sequels, and that's another thing. You can actually watch Hellraiser Inferno without having seen the sequels in between the first and this one, and I think that actually kind of helps things and makes it less narratively confusing, since Hellraiser Inferno is wholly separated from all the stuff that came before, But anyway, though, that's the movie I chose for this little double feature Fright Night, and she had never seen it before, but she actually liked it. So I was like, all right, so it's always cool when, a friend of yours who, happens to be, a lovely woman, also, happens to like comic books and, horror movies and stuff like that. And, the movie you pick turns out to be, a success, and you're like, yes. And so then we watched The Ring, and that was like, holy shit, that was scary. Or at least the visuals on that were scary. I remember, after we said adios and everything, it's like, that wasn't the scariest movie I'd seen, but there was just something about the visuals in The Ring that was kind of like, I'm about to go to bed. I do not want those things to be the last thing I see in my mind before I go to sleep. And so I remember I read something that was considerably more upbeat than, the two horror movies we just watched. But anyway, though, another fond memory I have of Inferno is that there was a wine bar that used to be over here in Addison called Mercy's, and it was a really cool place. I loved going there. You had a good crew of people, and it was a nice atmosphere. And I remember there was a guy who worked there, and we kind of hit it off. We talked about horror movies and stuff like that. And somewhere along the way, we started talking about the Hellraiser movies, and he'd only seen like maybe the first two or something like that, and maybe one of the others. But I was like, "Have you ever seen Inferno?" Because, we were talking about also the Marvel movies too, and so, because like I want to say that was around the time Doctor Strange was about to come out. I don't remember if it had actually come out yet. But I was like, the guy who's doing Doctor Strange also did a Hellraiser movie. And the guy's like, really? And so, I was like, tell you what, next time I come in, are you going to be here on such and such day? And he's like, yeah. And it's like, I'll let you borrow Hellraiser Inferno if you promise to take care of it. And he's like, dude, one horror fan to another, you got it. And so I remember I let him borrow it. And, I remember when I went back to Mercy again, he's like, dude, this was good. And I was like, all right. So, it's definitely a movie that I've watched with some, friends that, they too, got a kick out of it. And so, that's something that's positive that I associate with the movie. But yeah, so, those are some of my thoughts on Hellraiser Inferno. Another divisive sequel in the Hellraiser series. And I do understand why a lot of people don't like it, because there's not a huge focus on Pinhead. He's a small part of the story. I mean, an important part of the story, but a small part. I mean, in that way, it kind of harkens back to the original. But at the same time, after having seen him, take the spotlight in parts 3 and 4, and since Doug Bradley, frankly, did such a good job playing him in those movies, even though I have my issues with those two. A lot of people were pissed off that, Pinhead only was in the Inferno for a few minutes. I mean, I could definitely understand why people got pissed off and don't like the movie. But at the same time, for those who, have more of an appreciation for, say, Hellraiser 1 and 2, I think they would actually like Inferno in the sense that it harkens back to those two entries, in the sense that the Cenobites are a part of the story, but they're not stealing the spotlight, as it were. But yeah, like I said, those are my thoughts. Oh yeah, sorry, one other thing. As far as Clive Barker not liking it, I mean, I can understand, why, he didn't like it, especially if he, was, not given the chance to be involved with making it, which apparently that's what happened. The production company, was kind of like, nope, we don't want you in on, the franchise you created. So, but I did hear, though, that I've heard mixed things as far as, Hellraiser Inferno supposedly having started off as a standalone horror movie originally that had nothing to do with Hellraiser, but there was like something about copyrights or about to rights about to expire, and so supposedly they were like, okay, let's turn this into a Hellraiser movie. And so Scott Derrickson and his writing partner like, ta-da! But then again, I mean, this all depends on who you talk to, but I need to check in on this, but I believe there is a podcast interview with Scott Derrickson in which he kind of clears the air on it, in that Hellraiser Inferno actually was an original idea for a Hellraiser movie. He and his writing partner actually did work on a script as standalone Hellraiser horror movie that wasn't connected to the other entries that came prior to it. And so, but I think the confusion kind of came into play because this was around the time that Miramax, I think that was the company, was about to lose the rights, and so they were like, they kind of rushed through the whole process and snapped up the first script that they had. But it's just that right after Inferno, that's when I think 3 other of the Hellraiser movies came out, one after the other. And those three movies for sure started off as standalone horror movies that had nothing to do with Hellraiser. But, in order to hang on to the rights, they were forced into being Hellraiser movies. And so, I mean, it's easy to lump Hellraiser Inferno into that category simply because of how atypical it feels from other Hellraiser movies that came prior to it. Like I said, it feels more like a hybrid of Jacob's Ladder and Bad Lieutenant, which is something that is often said of it. So and like I said, I'm actually in agreement on it. Throw in some Silent Hill, and then Pinhead kind of shows up here and there, But so it doesn't feel like a Hellraiser movie per se, in the sense of being, if you compare it to, say, the movies that came prior to it. But at the same time, though, if you look at it as a standalone, movie within the Hellraiser series, I mean, it kind of holds up, rather well. I mean, there are some, WTF moments, like that kind of have you scratching your head. I mean, like the bit in the cowboy bar. There's. It feels more like something out of a bizarre, David Lynch, directed episode of Twin Peaks or something like that than anything from Hellraiser, and it clashes very much with things. But yeah, I mean, it has its problems, but what it does well, it does well. And, like I said, I think it's a worthwhile entry in the series, and it definitely stands, above, the stuff that came after it. With the possible exception of, say, the new Hellraiser movie, because I still need to see that. And I've only seen parts of Revelations and Judgment, but I still need to see the whole thing for both movies in both cases. But yeah, I have seen 6, 7, and 8, and I can tell you that Inferno is easily better than those three. So yeah, those are my thoughts. Not quite a review, but just wanted to throw some thoughts on this Divisive sequel, and I hope y'all appreciated hearing about it. And if you like what you see here, please feel free to like and subscribe. You want to give some feedback, I would love to hear it. But yeah, y'all have a good day. Take care. Goodbye.